Welcome, Fright Night Vault listeners. Tonight's story begins not in some ruined asylum or crumbling farmhouse, but in the kind of place we pass by every day. Quiet, unassuming, suburban streets lined with ordinary houses. But sometimes the ordinary holds the deepest terror. Listen closely and remember, the vault never lies. Subscribe to the vault and never walk alone again. It began with a family of 4 moving into a modest home on the edge of town. Nothing about the place seemed unusual. Freshly painted siding, a cracked driveway, and a lone porch light that buzzed faintly in the night. Daniel, the father, was tired of renting and wanted something permanent for his family. His wife, Marissa, loved the quiet neighborhood, safe and unremarkable. Their children, Eli and Harper, were thrilled by the backyard and the patch of woods beyond it. For a while, everything felt like a new beginning. Boxes were unpacked, laughter carried through the hallways, and neighbors gave polite waves as they drove by. The rhythms of normal life settled quickly, but it was Harper who noticed first. One night, long after she should have been asleep, she stood at her bedroom window. The porch light glowed orange, casting long shadows across the yard. At the edge of the driveway, she saw something. A figure, tall, dark, and perfectly still. She whispered for her brother. Eli stumbled out of bed, annoyed, and joined her at the glass, but by then the driveway was empty. He teased her, said it was a shadow from a car, and told her to go back to sleep. Harper didn't argue, but she couldn't shake what she had seen. The next evening, Daniel came home late. As he pulled into the driveway, his headlights caught a tall shape just beyond the reach of the light. For a second, he thought someone was standing there, watching. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and it was gone. He told himself it was fatigue. He said nothing to Marissa. In the nights that followed, little things began to unsettle them. The family dog refused to step off the porch after dark. It would growl low, its gaze locked on the far end of the driveway. The neighbors across the street sometimes lingered outside, staring toward the house before quickly retreating indoors. When Daniel waved, they looked away. And then Harper saw it again. The figure, always at the edge of the driveway, where the cracked pavement met the street, never moving, never walking closer, just standing, watching. No matter how long she stared, she could never make out a face. It was more like an absence, a shape that didn't belong. The house was ordinary, the family was ordinary, the street was ordinary, but every night the shadow returned, and whether they admitted it aloud or not, each of them began to feel the same truth. Something had claimed the driveway, something that was not leaving. The sightings became harder to ignore. Harper stopped sleeping through the night. Every time she glanced through her curtains, she expected to see it, and more often than not, she did. The figure stood in the exact same spot, its outline darker than the surrounding night. It never moved, never walked closer, never waved. It was simply there, as if waiting for something. Daniel brushed it off, telling himself his daughter had an overactive imagination. But then, one evening, as he carried the trash bins to the curb, he felt it. Not saw, not heard, felt. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. His skin prickled, the hairs on his arms rising as if electricity crawled beneath them. He froze at the end of the driveway, his eyes drawn toward the streetlight. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw the shadow standing just outside the circle of light. The next morning, he found the trash bin tipped over. The lid was split and cracked, as if someone or something had struck it with force. Marissa began noticing other changes. Muddy footprints leading up the sidewalk that stopped halfway, disappearing before they reached the porch. Handprints smudged across Eli's bedroom window, far too high for either child to reach. The prints looked wrong, the fingers unnaturally long. Eli, who had once laughed at his sister, started to believe. He swore he heard scratching outside his window at night. Sometimes he would hear a faint tapping, as if fingernails were brushing against the glass. When he tried to catch it in the act, nothing was there. Rumors began to circulate through the neighborhood. Marissa overheard two women at the grocery store speaking in hushed voices about that house at the end of the street, about the family that moved in, the one being watched. When she asked them directly what they meant, they fell silent, exchanged nervous glances, and quickly walked away. The tension inside the house grew heavier. Arguments broke out between Daniel and Marissa. She wanted to call the police, but he insisted no one would take them seriously. What could they report? That a shadow was standing in their driveway? They would be laughed out of the station. But the children knew. They felt it more than the adults did. Harper stopped sitting near the windows altogether. Eli insisted on keeping his bedroom lamp on through the night, even though it did nothing to keep the darkness from pressing against the glass. The entity's presence became undeniable. It wasn't content to linger at the edge anymore. Small changes revealed themselves. The dog's water bowl overturned in the yard. Deep gouges scratched into the wooden fence. The mailbox bent and twisted as though someone had gripped it with both hands and wrenched it sideways. And then, one night, the dog was gone. Daniel searched the backyard with a flashlight, his voice breaking as he called out again and again. The leash lay snapped in two by the porch steps. In the distance from the far end of the driveway, a shape shifted, tall, unmoving, watching. When Daniel's light swept across it, there was nothing there. But when he turned back toward the house, Harper was waiting at the window, her face pale. She whispered three words Daniel would never forget. It was closer. The shadow was no longer content with the edge of the street. It was moving. The night the shadow finally crossed the boundary began like all the others. The house sat quiet, the porch light humming weakly against the dark. Daniel tried to distract himself with the television while Marissa read in bed. Eli had his lamp on, fighting sleep. Harper sat awake, too frightened to close her eyes. Sometime after midnight, the air shifted. The crickets outside fell silent. Even the breeze seemed to stop. The silence was so complete it pressed against the walls of the house, suffocating. And then came the sound. 3 heavy knocks echoed from the driveway. Not at the door, not against the walls, on the concrete itself. Each strike reverberated through the ground, shaking picture frames on the walls. Daniel bolted upright, his chest tight, while Marissa clutched her blanket in trembling hands. When he forced himself to the window, his worst fear was waiting. The shadow was no longer at the far end of the driveway. It stood halfway up, its shape darker and more solid than ever before. Tall, too tall, with shoulders that stretched unnaturally wide. Its head tilted back as if staring directly at the window. Daniel whispered for his children to stay away from the glass, but it was too late. Eli had already seen it. Harper was already crying. Another knock shook the house, closer this time. The figure had not moved, and yet the sound now came from the porch steps. Daniel grabbed a flashlight, his hands shaking, and pulled open the front door. The beam of light cut through the night, landing on nothing but the empty steps. For a moment he believed it had gone. Then Harper screamed. From her window, she saw it standing at the bottom of the porch, inches from where her father stood. The figure was tall enough that its head nearly touched the porch light, and for the first time she could see details. Hollow sockets where eyes should be, glowing faintly with a sickly white light. A mouth stretched too wide, jagged teeth glinting faintly as if wet. Daniel swung the flashlight down, but the beam passed straight through it. The figure did not fade. It only leaned closer, the light inside its sockets burning brighter, locking him in place. His breath caught in his throat as his skin turned cold, as though frost was spreading across his chest. Behind him, the children cried out. Marissa screamed for him to come inside. But Daniel couldn't move. The shadow raised one hand, long fingers extended, sharp and bony, reaching toward him. And then the scratching began. Not on the door, not on the windows, from inside the walls themselves. Thin, deliberate strokes dragging across the wood and plaster as if marking the house from within. The figure was no longer just outside. It had seeped in. Eli shouted that he saw it behind him, in the hallway. Harper swore it was by the kitchen window. Marissa backed into the corner of the living room, clutching the children against her, her eyes darting from doorway to doorway. Every shadow stretched too long, every corner seemed deeper. Wherever Daniel turned, the figure loomed, sometimes outside, sometimes inside, always there. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a rasping hiss that echoed inside their skulls. A sound that was not meant for human ears, low and hungry, vibrating through the bones. The children clutched their heads, sobbing. Marissa screamed. Daniel dropped the flashlight as the sound overwhelmed him. The porch light above them flickered and died. And in the suffocating dark, the figure stepped forward. The house was never the same after that night. Daniel didn't remember collapsing on the porch, but Marissa swore she dragged him back inside. His skin was clammy, his lips nearly blue, as though he had been standing in a frozen wasteland instead of their front steps. For hours afterward, the children sat huddled together, shaking, too terrified to close their eyes. By morning, the figure was gone. No footprints, no marks, nothing that could be shown to the police. The only evidence lay in the gouges along the walls of the living room, deep scratches carved into the wood and plaster from the inside out. Neighbors avoided them more openly now. People crossed the street instead of walking past their house. Cars sped by without slowing. When Marissa tried to ask a neighbor what they knew, the woman simply whispered, "It doesn't stop. Not once it chooses you," before slamming her door shut. Daniel refused to sleep upstairs again. He moved a mattress into the living room where he kept the lights on through the night. Marissa left bowls of salt at the windowsills, desperate for protection. The children jumped at every sound, convinced the shadow would return. And it did. Never during the day. Never when others could see. Always at night. Always at the edge of the driveway. Sometimes closer. Sometimes at the porch. Once, Daniel woke to find it standing at the bottom of the staircase inside the house, waiting. They tried rituals whispered about by neighbors. Candles, prayers, old songs. Nothing kept it away for long. The lights flickered. The scratching returned. The presence pressed heavier with each night. Soon, the family adapted to its visits the way one adapts to a storm. They closed their curtains before dark. They whispered to each other in low voices when the knocks began. They stopped calling the police, stopped seeking help. The town had already turned its back on them. The shadow never left. It never relented. It never spoke again. But its hunger was obvious in the way it lingered, in the way the air turned colder when it drew near. The family carried scars that no one else could see. Dark circles under their eyes, trembling hands, the quiet despair of people who no longer felt safe in their own home. And yet the figure did not finish them. It never truly attacked, never claimed its victims outright. It only watched, always watching. At the far edge of the driveway, at the porch, at the window, waiting. It still hungers, subscribe to the vault, and never walk alone again. Listen in the dark, watch with the lights off, and if you ever see a figure standing still at the edge of your driveway, do not look too long. Once it knows you've seen it, it will not leave. We upload daily, and one night, the story may be yours. If you have a story of your own, please feel free to add it in the comments. You never know, the next story could be yours. See you on the next video.